Chapter 2, Recursive Evolution. Chapter 2.1, Figuring Out the Creator. The reader has the right to ask, if neither Darwinism, nor creationism, nor the intelligent design live up to the author's satisfaction, is he going to offer something original, new, which would eliminate the discrepancies of the existing concepts? Yes, I am going to. But does the author presume that his hypothesis negates everything accumulated by the greatest minds before him? No way. On the contrary, I want to show that there is no contradiction between the above concepts. I intend to make full use of the wealth of knowledge, with a small part of which I managed to get acquainted. This part includes about 150 books in Russian and English, a couple of 100 articles in scientific and popular magazines, and no less than 500 hours of video screens of lectures, debates, and films. It also observed the analysis of hundreds of pages of the pivotal monkey-Dover process and long conversations with experts in various fields, from information technology to biology. Now, summing up the accumulated knowledge and trying to treat with respect and without bias any opinion, from young earthers to the fanatical followers of St. Darwin's sect, I concluded that they all bear the grain of truth. We should merely combine them and look at the result from the right angle. The presence of an intelligent designer is not denied. On the contrary, we accept his existence as a working hypothesis. Let us begin our analysis with an obvious assumption, namely, the existence of the Creator as he is depicted in the Scriptures. According to the Bible, he is omnipotent and omnipresent, is not he? This claim creates at least two logical paradoxes. The first of them is called the Omnipotence Paradox. The most well-known version of this paradox reads, "Could God create a stone so heavy that even he could not lift it?" Theologians may object that by this far-fetched question, we are trying to drive God into the Procrustean bed of human logic. In ordinary terms, the paradox is irrefutable. But God, the theologians retort, because he is omnipotent, is beyond our logic. This sophism suits many, but does not directly answer the question. Obviously, the very postulate of omnipotence is logically contradictory. If so, then whoever the Creator is, he cannot be absolutely omnipotent. And if so, it is necessary to determine the limits of his power. Even the Old Testament tells us that he created all visible and invisible, not instantaneously, but within 6 days. We should presume, therefore, that he is very, very powerful, but his power has some limitations. Is it a matter to you whether his power exceeds your power 1,000,000 times or 1,000,000 of 1,000,000 times? We cannot even think of competing with him or try to understand him anyway. For us, the preeminence of 1,000,000-fold or infinite means the same thing. Therefore, I am ready to admit the existence of the Creator that is not absolutely omnipotent, but superior to my weak forces many, many times. This is quite enough. Do you think we commit a blasphemy by this assumption? Well, you did not read the Scriptures well. Genesis 32. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Realizing all the metaphoric revelation of the Holy Scripture, we are still surprised that God does not overcome the mortal Jacob and asks him to let him go. The Book of Job, 40. Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his? Here, the biblical God directly compares his powers with the muscles of the wretched sufferer. So their forces are at least comparable? Now, let us look at the chronology of our biosphere. The first pre-nuclear organisms, prokaryotes, appeared about 4 billion years ago. Those prokaryotes did not change much to this day and fell quite well. These are bacteria, blue-green algae, and archaea. Note that the prokaryote is already a fully formed cellular organism. He has a plasma membrane, a flagellum with its electric motor, and even DNA. They are lacking a nucleus in some other parts, organelles. They also do not carry power stations, mitochondria. Prokaryotes are the simplest, though incredibly complex creatures. It is a self-replicating brick from which nature started to build other organisms. For example, nature can create a nuclear cell, eukaryote, from it and hide the precious DNA chromosomes into the nucleus. It is possible to bring a mitochondrion to the cell so that it produces the energy for its needs. You can add Golgi apparatus, which would synthesize complex proteins. You can combine many cells into a single multicellular organism and teach each cell to perform a certain function. Some cells will think, others digest food, others will cause the body to move or stay upright. Why did nature hesitate so long? A century has passed, then 1,000 years, then 1,000,000. 1,000,000 years? Really? The history of all mankind is several times shorter than 1,000,000. It takes 1,000 times 1,000,000 years. And finally, there are the first organisms that can use the energy of sunlight. There came a photosynthesis. And this took 1,000,000,000 years for the Almighty? Truly, he was not in a hurry. A man, a weak, stupid, and sinful man, quickly learned to use solar energy. I repeat, there is no blasphemy in our reasoning. I just honestly try to understand the nature and motives of the Creator. After another 1,000,000,000 years, more complex organisms, cells that have a nucleus, eukaryotes, emerged. We have already mentioned the immense complexity of this universal brick from which multicellular creatures were created. The development of the biosphere accelerated slightly, but the path was not smooth and continuous. Approximately 540 million years ago, the so-called Cambrian explosion happened. For some mysterious reason, the lazy deployment of living organisms has turned into a rapidly accelerated process. By the way, the Cambrian explosion is one of the strongest arguments of the creationists. Unexpectedly, the creatures with non-amorphous structure appeared on the Earth. New clams, corals, and trilobites suddenly acquired skeletons. That was a huge leap in the development of the animal world. It is believed that some of them acquired the sensors that felt a smell and were capable to determine body position in space. They even had 2 pairs of eyes, one pair of compound eyes and a pair of smaller eye spots called oculi, located between the other larger pair of eyes. A very small number of findings suggest that attempts to create such creatures were also carried out in the pre-Cambrian, but the bulk of the achievements appeared almost from nowhere. Please note, the task for the Creator at this stage has become greatly complicated. Multicellular and diverse organisms are much more challenging to design and build than to maintain a proliferation of existing unicellular organisms. Coordinated existence of different cells in a single complex organism required them to assume specialized functions. Some cells built a skeleton, others muscles, still others something else. If the simplest sponges had only 5 types of cells, while the first chordates accounted for 50 to 60 different types of specialized cells performing various functions. Nature designed and built previously unknown proteins, and for each protein, you need to create a set of codes embedded in the chromosomes. If the simplest form of life requires a volume of information about 320,000 pairs in DNA, less amount does not work even theoretically, then a complex cell needs 1,000,000 of such pairs. An ordinary fruit fly's DNA contains 140 million pairs, and all these pairs are arranged in strict order, carrying hereditary information. With increasing length of the chromosome and growing numbers of pairs in them, the complexity of building an organism increases exponentially. Surprisingly, the Creator performed this mission in the relatively short period of time, estimated not by billions, but only tens of millions of years. For, roughly speaking, within 50 to 60 millions of years, most of the existing phyla of living organisms still inhabiting the Earth have arisen. Among those were fishes, which are one of the most successful and adapted creatures in the history of the biosphere. Despite the exponentially increasing complexity, the emergence of new organisms continued at an accelerating rate. In 25 million years after the appearance of fishes, another revolution took place. Living entities, plants, creeped to the land. Can you imagine the magnitude of difficulties for such a transition? Life underwater and on land is radically different. Another 75 million years, there were first insects and seed plants. 40 million years passed, a new leap. Amphibians appeared with their most complex organism. In another 60 million, there are reptiles. And after another 100 million came the mammals. All these new forms present qualitative changes in the structure of the living world. It takes 50 million years. The first birds flew up into the sky. Another 20 million, and for the joy of birdies, the earth was covered with flowers. It happened 130 million years ago. The modern history was at the arm's length. It was time for the man to come to the existence. But the planet was already inhabited by large reptiles, dinosaurs. Their contemporaries, the mammals, could not compete with those giants. The predatory theropods, wild beast-footed in Greek, grew to 15 meters in length and accounted for almost 40% of all known genera of dinosaurs. Some of them, pterosaurs, even managed to fly, leaving to others no chance to escape. These cruel animals instilled fear and horror both on land and in the air for almost 160 million years. Advantage in the mass allowed these monsters to manage a minimum amount of intelligence and ingenuity. The brain of a huge stegosaurus weighed only 75 grams. If the ratio of the mass of the brain to the body weight ratio is taken as an intelligence criterion, then the predator could boast with a mark of 1 to 50,000. For the dog, this ratio is 1 to 125, and for a human, 1 to 40. A time for the man, and even less intelligent dogs, did not come yet. It came after all the dinosaurs suddenly died out. It happened about 65 million years ago and happened very quickly. The dominant scientific view on the cause of the death of these unpleasant and stupid creatures is the fall of a giant asteroid. Scientists have indeed found a giant meteorite crater on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and decided that it is more convenient to blame the heavenly body than to seek out more plausible natural causes of this mass extinction. At that time, about 1/6 of all land animals died out, including almost all dinosaurs. But the mammals mysteriously survived. Scientists account for 5 great mass extinctions, when one group of living organisms replaced the other. Each of them occurred for unclear reasons, but each time the extinction led to the emergence of more complex and numerous living beings. Each next generation was smarter than the previous one. Let us take note of this fact. The new generations were not so more capable of survival, but always emerged with a bigger relative size of the brain. Figuratively speaking, the stupid animals were dying out and the smart ones replaced them. Evolutionists invented another theory claiming that the extinctions occur because of the sudden deteriorating of the environmental conditions. They proposed that the fitter kinds replace the less adapted ones. But if this would have been a case, the new species would have to be more adapted to the changed habitat conditions. They would acquire better resistance to temperature changes, unpretentious eating habits, give birth to cubs who can stand up for themselves from the moment of birth. They would not produce an offspring, which had to be grown to maturity for months or years. In reality, new species became more dependent on temperature, the presence of certain foods, etc. New organisms did not arise as more adapted to the environment, but they were surprisingly more intelligent. As soon as the dinosaurs disappeared, the viviparous mammals began to fill the earth. These animals bear more developed brains than the dinosaurs. The main difference between them and the predecessors was the presence of yet another revolutionary innovation, the neocortex. In early-stage mammals, the neocortex was barely noticeable, while in humans, it is the main part of the cerebral cortex which is responsible for conscious thinking. Somehow appears a class of animals that were qualitatively more intelligent. The first primates appeared. They came from nowhere with no or very little evidences for predecessors. No one can deny that they immediately took a leading spot as the smartest, not the fittest animals. This is especially true of the higher primates, which appear about 30 million years ago. In just 28 million years after that, the Homo genus came to Earth. It happened about 2.5 million years ago. Have you noticed that life forms are increasingly complicated, but their creation has been taking less and less time? Modern man appeared, it is believed, about 200,000 years ago. The time between new species shrunk from tens of millions to tens of thousands years. Think about it again. Life becomes more sophisticated, complexity of organisms, and the most incomprehensible part of them, the brain, increases exponentially, and new species appeared faster than previous ones by an order of magnitude? The only logical conclusion that arises after a brief analysis of the evolution of the living world. The Creator's abilities and intellect increased and multiplied simultaneously with the combined intellect of the living world. See where I am going to? If the Creator's intelligence increases simultaneously and in concert with the intelligence of the living world, then a simple logical consequence arises. He is an integral part of this world. But can nature create something that is more perfect than itself? Gödel's theorem, mentioned in the previous section, asserts that this is impossible in principle. However, it happens, and soon we will learn how. Scientific journalist John Horgan in the book The End of Science writes, "Now, The more we fix our attention on the continuity of life, the more we see that organic evolution resembles the evolution of a consciousness, in which the past presses against the present and causes the upspringing of a new form of consciousness, incommensurable with antecedents. Bergson, a French philosopher, did not believe that if there was a God of the evolutionary process, he was not an external God, but a God who created himself in the very process of evolution. It is appropriate to recall the concept of Ben Jacob that was mentioned in the previous part, which according to the book by Howard Bloom, The Global Brain, sounds like this. Vitalism is not the only alternative to Darwinism. I propose a new version of a joint evolution based on the formation of a creative network. In our book, we accept this very concept. Intelligent designer exists. He is a part of the living world and develops with it. His power is not infinite. It is not constant. It evolves over time. Prominent English mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead suggested that what really changes God is what happens in the world. Whitehead wrote, "It is as true to say that God creates the world as that the world creates God."